Welcome to the 7th episode of the first season of Justice Center Weekly, a 30-minute video cast from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Our guest today is Luke Neilson, the Education Programs Coordinator at the Justice Center. Luke recently authored a paper on digital IDs and has done a fair bit of work on that file. But today we're going to discuss another project he's been involved with at the Center. This is the development of a high school curriculum on our rights and freedoms, which is to be unveiled shortly, as you will hear. First, Luke, welcome to the show, and perhaps we can start off by asking you how this project came about. What's the rationale? After all, aren't teenagers entitled enough nowadays? Do we have to teach them more about their rights?
Thanks for having me on the show today, Kevin. The rationale for a high school curriculum is this. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the supreme law in Canada, and very few Canadians are aware of that. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees every Canadian rights and freedoms. So the purpose of the curriculum is to solve a knowledge gap in Canada. Now, the Justice Center has been working on this project since 2016. As you can imagine, developing a high school curriculum is a very elaborate project. And so we've really taken up the project again in earnest this year. We've received funding from the Jackman Foundation to create this curriculum. And I'm excited to let you know, and Canadians know, that we're going to be sharing the first module at the upcoming Alberta Home Education Association Conference in Red Deer, Alberta, later this week. So, maybe teenagers today are entitled, but I think it's because maybe they don't actually know what rights and freedoms they're entitled to. And so, of course, this curriculum is designed to solve that problem.
Perhaps we can just go back and focus a little bit on that knowledge gap because, I would assume that this would be covered in curriculum nowadays. I think when you looked at this, did you look at what was already being taught and decide that this was inadequate, or how did you go about approaching that?
That's a great question, Kevin. Of course, a project of this magnitude should start with a survey of what's being offered to high schoolers across the country. And after looking at social sciences programs and history programs, it's very apparent to me that Canadian high school students are not being equipped to understand their democracy, their political institutions, the law, or their rights and freedoms. High school students don't just turn into workers and community volunteers. They turn into participants in a democracy. They have to know what the law says. They have to know what their rights and freedoms are. And so this course is designed to equip high school students to become effective citizens in their own democracy, to understand the law, to understand what they owe each other, and what, of course, the government owes them.
From what I understand, these used to be called civics, but I think that was back in ancient times before, I would say, the charter. But anyway, can you give us an idea of what this first module is all about?
So the first module deals with a very important section of the charter, the section of the charter that protects freedom of expression. So, of course, we are expressive creatures. We talk, we speak, we plant flags on distant moons, we protest governments, we engage in scientific inquiry. We are very expressive creatures, but of course, the fact that we have the capacity for language and expression generates an interesting problem. Sometimes we use our expression for harmful ends or intolerable purposes, right? Sometimes people use language to incite others to commit acts of violence. Sometimes people use their capacity for language to spread false stories. And so this is called the problem of free expression. We want to live in a world where expression is protected because it's so valuable to us. But also we want governments to limit expression. We want the law to limit expression that is harmful to others. And so really this course is an investigation of the reasons that lawmakers have for limiting some kinds of expression. But ultimately, Kevin, it's a defense of the value of free expression. It's a defense of the importance that human beings be able to discover and share and debate and dialogue and challenge. Um, and so I think that's a great place to start in the curriculum.
Yeah, the one thing that would worry me about any discussion of this type of thing would be the tendency for people to just get scared off and self-censor. Is that brought up at all in the curriculum? The idea that people just back away from speech because they don't know the limits, so they can't risk going falling afoul of the law.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, of course, if you don't understand what your freedom of expression is or how it's legally protected in Canada, I can see a lot of people being afraid to express themselves because they're not sure if there will be consequences for expressing themselves. And so, one aim of this course is to help students understand, what is the law? What can you say in Canada? How much freedom of expression do you really enjoy? I think people will find that they enjoy a lot more freedom of expression in Canada than they're aware of. And so, one hope of this course is that people are more expressive. They're more creative. They're more willing to debate and dialogue, even about contentious issues. Um, yeah, the hope is for students to feel equipped to be bold and courageous when expressing themselves.
Okay, good. That addresses that concern. Now, this module that you're talking about, it's one of how many approximately? Do you have an end goal here?
Well, this is a very fine question. I mean, the charter it's a short document, but it's a very rich document, and
Yeah.
there are many rights and freedoms contained within that document, such as the freedom of conscience, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of association, your right to mobility, your right to equality, your right to security. And so I can't say at this point how many modules will be contained within the curriculum. The goal of the curriculum is to provide students with a rich understanding of all of the rights and freedoms that are protected by the Charter. And more than that, some of the philosophical or moral reasons for the Charter's existence. I mean, the Charter doesn't have authority just because it's the law. I mean, it certainly does have authority because it's the law. But really, the Charter captures important human values, right? It defends freedom of expression because freedom of expression matters. It protects mobility rights and security rights and equality rights because mobility, security, and equality matter. So, this course is also an investigation of some of the reasons we have for protecting those rights and freedoms in the first place.
Okay. Now I understand that you're kind of like the lead author on this. You basically put this together yourself. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more detail about that first module in freedom of expression. Are you starting off with ancient history? Are you going to contemporary examples right away and then working your way back? How do you progress through the topic of freedom of expression in Canada?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I am the sort of primary author on the curriculum. Of course, the Justice Center is a very democratic place, and we've had a lot of really valuable feedback and insight from our very fine litigators, from our communications team. So, yeah, this is a project with many voices. But the freedom of expression module starts with an observation, which I've already mentioned. We're expressive beings. Sometimes we use our capacity for expression for very fine ends, and sometimes we use our capacity for expression to hurt people or to harm others. And so we have this problem, which is we want to live in a world where the good expression occurs and the bad expression does not occur. How do we bring that world about? One solution, and governments have been doing this for thousands of years, is simply to entrust the government to make the right decisions on our behalf. Now, of course, governments don't always make the right decisions on our behalf. I'm reminded of Socrates, who was executed for his philosophical expression. I'm reminded of Jesus, who was executed for his spiritual expression. I'm reminded of Galileo, who was threatened with execution for sharing his scientific expression. I'm reminded of the hundreds of protesters in Tiananmen Square who were mowed down by the government for protesting the government. So the point is, governments can't always be trusted to make the right decisions about what expression should be permitted and what expression should not be permitted. And so, of course, people band together and they write bills and declarations and charters that protect freedom of expression. And we see this in many democracies across the world. And the goal is that when freedom is limited, when our capacity for language is limited by governments, it's done lawfully and it's done reasonably and it's done rightfully. It's really a protection for citizens against agents that want to limit your expression for maybe the wrong reasons. So that's kind of the justification for the curriculum in the first place. Then the curriculum looks at a few different theories about why free expression matters. So perhaps you've heard of John Stuart Mill, who's a famous English philosopher and political economist and civil servant. He thinks that it's only reasonable to limit freedom of expression if that expression violates the rights of other people. And his example is an angry mob is gathered outside of the home of a corn dealer. And they're very upset with the corn dealer. And somebody comes along and says, the corn dealer has been starving the poor. Now, this language whips the mob into a frenzy. They march into the home of the corn dealer. They violate his property rights, his right to security, and even his right to life. And so Mill says, look, it is reasonable for the law to prohibit speech that clearly and directly violates the rights of other people. But any other kind of expression shouldn't be penalized by governments or by lawmakers because we need expression to discover the truth. In fact, we even need falsehoods to discover the truth. He has this really clever argument where he says, look, why would we permit falsehoods to permeate public discourse? And he says, well, when we allow people to sincerely share even false beliefs, when we allow people to challenge things that are recognized as true, we sharpen our understanding of the truth. Like imagine a scientific theory, Kevin, like a theory about, I don't know, the sun revolving around the earth. For thousands of years, people believed that the sun revolved around the earth. We know today that that is false. But of course, you have academics and scholars and politicians busily protecting a theory about the sun revolving around the earth. And then Galileo comes along and he starts spreading falsehoods, right? He starts saying, hey, maybe the sun is the center of our solar system. So he starts challenging a very entrenched orthodox theory about the world. And in doing so, he sharpens our understanding of the truth. He makes our theories about the world a little more true than they otherwise would have been. And so that's why, according to Mill, freedom of expression should be protected because it helps us discover the truth. Even when we get it wrong sometimes, even when our arrows don't hit the mark, having a really free and expansive protection for expression allows us to discover the truth and expand our knowledge about the world. And so, I mean, that's one theory we look at. Another theory is the autonomy theory. And I find this really compelling. So according to the autonomy theory, people are autonomous, or they should be, right? They should have some degree of independence. They should enjoy free will. And if governments censor what people can hear, they're not able to access information about the world. They're not able to make decisions for themselves. They're not able to hear expression and decide for themselves whether they'll believe in it. They can't hear expression and decide for themselves whether that expression should motivate action or policy. And so if we're going to be autonomous, right, if we're going to enjoy free will and independence, we have to have access to a diversity of perspectives. For the government to preemptively censor expression because they've determined that, it's good for them to hear this, but not that, that really limits people's autonomy. And finally, this is a really important theory. Freedom of expression matters because democracy matters, and we can't be effective participants in a democracy if we don't have access to a diversity of viewpoints, right? I'm reminded of the decision of Justice Lyman Duff, who said that something like discussion and debate are the breath of life in parliamentary democracies, right? We need to have an access to even expression we don't like to find the best ideas and to form the best policies. And so the curriculum, before diving into the law, starts to explore a few theories about why freedom of expression matters outside of the law, why freedom of expression should be protected by the law, because it helps us discover the truth, it helps us be autonomous, independent beings, and it helps us participate in a democracy to make the best decisions collectively. So then we get into the actual Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We look at what the law in Canada says. And then, of course, we end with a few Supreme Court cases that have shaped our understanding of freedom of expression in Canada. So, Kevin, that's an overview of the first module. My hope is that it will equip students to understand the reason for the law, right? I don't want students to just memorize what the law says. I want them to understand why the law says what it says. And so I'm hoping students gain that from the course.
Okay. Well, just to go with one example, your first example there, where you're talking about the mill theory, how is this presented to teenagers? That's what I'm wondering. I don't know much about developing curriculum, and I don't know how much you would know about keeping teenagers awake. But I know that, having had experience years ago in high school, we would often just sort of ignore the thing and then cram at the last second here. How is this presented to me? How are you going to present John Stuart Mill to teenagers? Are you giving it as a lecture? Are you assigning it as a reading list? What exactly are you doing to engage the students?
John Stuart Mill is very challenging. I have read him myself. The prose is challenging, the concepts are challenging. And so I think we're not going to demand that students read the primary sources in this case. I think that would
Okay.
be a little bit more appropriate for undergraduate students. Um, we're doing it like this. We're trying to translate John Stuart Mill or advocates of the autonomy theory or the democracy theory in a very accessible way. Um, I've worked with high school students for years. I have an understanding of what works for them, what kind of material they're prepared for. And so I think that we've done a fine job translating these fairly complicated theories into accessible language. Um, and of course, we help the students along with assignments. We ask them to explore their intuitions before diving into a section, right? I want them to capture what they think about an issue before they hear what John Stuart Mill has to say about it. I want them to reflect on what they believe before reading about the autonomy theory. And then finally, I ask students in the course to just critically reflect on what they've read, to try to capture as best they can what they've understood. A very fine component of the course, Kevin, is that we are going to be offering our services in grading and evaluating this curriculum. So if students and parents want support from the Justice Center, they can submit their assignments to us. We'll provide feedback on those assignments. And so, Kevin, I think that's a way of helping the student along. If they've missed something and they submit an assignment to us, we'll help them get back on track.
I see. I was going to sort of ask you about that. Have you field tested this? But it sounds like you have had some experience in this type of thing already. And by what you're proposing there, it sounds like that's a bit of a field test as well, because you're going to be getting further feedback. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my university days, I was a teaching assistant on first and second year undergraduate courses, and so I have a pretty strong idea of what your typical 18, 19, 20-year-old student looks like, what kind of material they find engaging. And then, of course, we'll be gaining feedback from students, right? We want to know if students are connecting with the curriculum, and having them submit assignments to us will be a very good way to get that feedback.
Okay, and you're starting off with the homeschoolers or home education group now. Is there a reason you started with that group there? Is that simply the most accessible at this particular point? Because I know the other option is to approach the government and try to get it into into a provincial public school. But maybe you could talk a little bit about why you've chosen this approach to start.
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, the ultimate goal is for this to make its way into the public school curriculum across Canada. Um, it's not just homeschoolers or private schoolers who need to know about their rights and freedoms. I think an entire generation of high schoolers need to learn a lot more about the law, a lot more about our political institutions, and how to navigate it all effectively. So, yeah, the ultimate goal is for this to make its way into the public school system. That, of course, is a long road. There's a lot of handshaking involved in that. There's a lot of meetings and procedures we have to follow to get into a public school. Um, there are two reasons for being at AHIA first. The first is I was a homeschooler myself from grade 3 to grade 12. And I know that many of the homeschoolers I grew up with really care about rights and freedoms. They care about the law. They care about all sorts of things that, um, like a lot of, they care about a lot of subject matter that isn't really presented in public schools. And so I'm really familiar with the audience. I'm really familiar with what they care about and value. Um, and yeah, I will feel at home at the AHIA conference. Um,
Okay, so you're going with what you know. Okay,
I'm
that
going with
makes
what I
sense.
know to start.
Okay. You said it's a long road to get it into the public education system. Have you started down that road yet, or are you going to be doing that after you sort of get the unveiling going at the homeschool level?
Yeah, great question. So, what we intend to do is to develop an entire curriculum um, and share it with whoever wants it. I imagine our most likely audience will be homeschoolers and private schools. Once we have the curriculum together, and once we've been gaining feedback from educators and students across the country for a year or two, then we'll train our sites on the public school system. So it is a multi-year project, Kevin. Um, the plan is to write the thing over the next year, to share it with Canadians, to see how they respond to it, to fine tune it, and then eventually set our sights on public education.
Right. Public education, though, of course, is provincial, and the charter is federal. So I just want to take a little side trip here and ask about human rights legislation. Is that going to be included anywhere in your modules? And that would that be particular to each province? How are you going to handle that?
That's a good question. Um, I would say that the focus of the curriculum is mostly on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But again, Kevin, we're taking this more expansive approach. We're trying to look at rights and freedoms as such, whether
Right.
or not they appear in the law. So, absolutely, I could see this course addressing provincial human rights legislation. I think that's absolutely compatible with the aim of the course.
Well, one of the things I first learned when I joined the Justice Center was sort of the different scopes of each of those. So I assume even in any teaching of the charter, you're going to have to sort of teach the limitations of the charter and perhaps mention the human rights legislation and I would say the limitations of that as well. So I can see it being involved. Can you not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a brief reading of the charter may leave one delighted. You may think, oh, my freedom of expression is guaranteed. Of course, the preamble to the charter says that, the government or the law can impose reasonable limitations on those freedoms of expression. So, if students are going to really understand free expression, they're going to have to understand limitations to free expression or to any other right and freedom. Um, and a lot of our understanding of appropriate limitations to rights and freedoms comes to us from, the Supreme Court and what decisions they've made in controversial cases like hate speech cases or misinformation cases or freedom of the press cases. And so, yeah, the course will absolutely address both the guaranteed freedoms and what we've considered to be appropriate limitations to those freedoms.
Okay. Great. Thanks for that introduction. I will just mention that back in my early days of reporting, I was put on the schools beat for the Alberta Report magazine. And at that point, I learned that a lot of people don't care about education, but the people that do care about education care about it a lot. So
Mhm.
that I suspect you're going to get a lot of feedback, and a lot of really good feedback, very passionate feedback probably, on this. And I hope you're looking forward to it, because it's coming your way.
Oh yeah, I mean that's part of the development phase, right? We want to design a curriculum that meets the needs of high school students across the country. Um, every single curriculum I've ever looked at has gone through a very rich process of gaining feedback, modifying assignments, right? So the Justice Center is really going to listen to educators and students, and ultimately we want to create the product that works for everyone. So.
Great. Well, I'm glad you were here to introduce us to this at the beginning of your journey, and I guess the Justice Center's journey as well. Thanks so much, Luke, for taking the time to talk to me, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Thanks, Kevin. It was great to be here.